this fun little bar at the bottom. They don't have recording set up in this room, and we do want to preserve this session, so I'm going to be recording it on my laptop. If you are here for Intro to Drupal 8 development, you're in the right place. My name's Mike Madison. I'm a technical architect at Acquia. And even though this is a government conference, and even though I don't work directly for the government anymore, I have spent the last roughly 8 years of my career doing government contracting of one variety or another. I worked at a national lab prior to being at Acquia. And over the last 2 years at Acquia, I've primarily worked with a state agency in New York. So thank you for joining me today. And a big part of what we're going to do today is sort of try to give you an easy ramp into Drupal 8 development. I have a confession to make. My background is not at all related to the work that I do. My bachelor's degree is in English and my master's degree is in design. So I've spent 15 years doing PHP development, but none of that development came from like a school background. So for those of you in the room that might be a program manager, I know there's at least a couple of you, that's okay, right? You can still be successful in this arena. You can still be successful as a Drupal 8 developer, even if you don't have a background in development. Having said that, it is a little bit more difficult. And one of the things I am going to mention as we go through today is BLT, which is an open source tool that Acquia has created. I presented on this a lot last year, so I'm not going to really touch on it much today. But you may see me run some BLT commands to help automate some of the processes that I'm doing, and that's where this is coming from. So I started learning about Drupal 8, as some of you may have, at DrupalCon some years back. And I sat through 2 or 3 years worth of talks, and I just had very little understanding of what was going on. I could use an IDE. I understood sort of generally how to develop, but this whole things aren't hooks anymore. Where do I write my code? How do I get this to actually execute? Was a real challenge for me. And I've overcome that challenge, thankfully, but it took me a little bit longer than I feel like I would have liked for it to. So what I'm hopefully going to do for you guys today is not so much show you how to write every conceivable line of Drupal 8 code, but I'm going to try and give you some sort of real-world examples of how to write code that you can actually run in a local environment or on a web server that will perhaps kickstart you into being able to develop for Drupal 8. We're going to talk about a lot of different topics sort of throughout the presentation today. And the second half of the talk is going to be sort of very example driven. So if you're not ready to look at some PHP code in a terminal, you might not want to hang out for the last half of the talk. These slides are already on the GovCon website, so you're welcome to download them, and this link is already live and public. So all of the examples that I'm going to be giving you today are already committed here, so you're welcome to download that code during this talk or after, just to see what it's all about. So let's do a quick and dirty intro into PHP and Drupal 8. And I'm going to switch over to my IDE. I happen to be using PHP Storm. It is not free, but it is good. I think the biggest takeaway I can give you here is use an IDE, and I'll say this again later. Drupal 8 does not work great when you're doing development, PHP development, using something like Sublime Text or Atom. Sure, you can use a text editor. I still use Sublime every day. You can see it in my doc. But it doesn't work very well with debuggers. It does not work as well when it comes to inspecting classes and looking for the definitions of what you're working with. So even if it is completely different from your standard workflow today, get an IDE, learn how to use it. You will not be sorry. In Drupal 8, the doc root has been slightly reorganized. I'm going to, by the way, approach this very much from the perspective that some of you may never have seen this before. So if some of this is a bit of a review, I apologize. I'll try not to spend too much time on it. Under the core directory is where you're actually going to find the Drupal core stuff, including all of their modules. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. There's a lot of good stuff in here. And then under the modules directory itself, outside of core, this is where you'll find any contrib or custom modules that we've downloaded. Now, this is actually the Drupal GovCon website that we're looking at here. This is also in a public Git repo that I'm happy to share the link to if you're interested. And here you can see several of the custom modules that we've written. In Drupal 8, custom modules basically have to have one thing, and that's a .info file, a .info.yaml file actually in this case. And there doesn't have to be a whole lot of fancy stuff in that file, and we're going to get much deeper into some other example modules later in the talk. YAML stands for yet another markup language. You will see it a lot of places. It is much easier to read than array syntax, but YAML essentially generates array syntax. So when you're talking about doing PHP development in Drupal 8, you're almost always going to be dealing with something inside of a custom module. You might be working within a custom theme, but I am the last person in the room that should be lecturing anybody on writing custom themes. So we're not going to go there today. So that's it. That is a quick and dirty intro to kind of where PHP lives in Drupal 8 and what that's going to look like. And we're going to talk a lot more deeply into that topic as we go. My first actual takeaway for you guys today as we start working into this is get ready to read. And if you don't know what this acronym is, I'll let you Google that on your own. But read the docs, read the manual. One of the things I think you're going to find with Drupal 8 development in general is the documentation is in some ways much, much better than what is out there for Drupal 7. And in many other ways, it's much, much harder to work with. With Drupal 7, you could go out to Drupal.org and you could find countless examples and countless tutorials on how to do everything under the sun. And a lot of that was actually the case because the Drupal 6 and Drupal 7 code was so similar. Even if you couldn't find a Drupal 7 example for what you were looking for, you might actually find a Drupal 6 example and somehow be able to like cobble that into something useful. With Drupal 8, most of the functions and most of the methods don't actually exist anymore, or if they do, they exist in some place totally different. And as a result of that, you're not going to find an example for it right there on the Drupal.org API docs. So that's the bad news. The good news is that most of what you want to do actually lives inside the code that you're already working with. And I'm just going to run back to the IDE here real quick. So let's say, for example, that there's something that you want to do that is similar to something that Drupal already does in the node module. Everything that Drupal does in core is defined somewhere in this node module. So if you want to know how Drupal does something for Node, you can go look at the node module and see how it works. This was a big change for me. I got really used to being lazy and going, oh, how does hook whatever work, and just immediately finding something I could copy and paste. And I would say that my experience today is that sometimes I get lucky and find that, sometimes I have to dig a little deeper. So let's talk a little bit about the evolution of coding from Drupal 6 and Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. So if you're writing PHP in an older version of Drupal, I would say 99% of the time, if you're trying to do anything, there's probably a hook for that. You want to define something, there's an info hook for that. You want to alter something, there's an alter hook for that. And if you're trying to do something else, there's probably a quick function for that, right? If you want to load some taxonomy term into memory so you can work with it, literally anywhere in Drupal, as long as Drupal's bootstrapped, you can go taxonomy term load and you got it. Like, you don't have to do anything special at all, you can just go find it. So while quick and easy, I suppose, there are some really major problems with this. One of my favorite examples is a Vue plugin that I had to use on a project some years back. And that Vue plugin did maybe 85% of what I wanted it to do. But it didn't do 100% of what I wanted it to do. And because of the way the module was built, my choices were hack a contrib module, which is a really terrible idea and you should never do it. Copy the module entirely and rename it something else and then continue building from there, which is also not a great idea. Or rebuild the first 85% of what I wanted from scratch so that I could get the final 15% to meet the requirement. And this was a pretty common problem if you were doing custom development in Drupal 7. If you wanted to extend something that already existed, there was no way to do that because of the lack of object orientation. This also, again, cause problems when it comes to reusing code and other operations as well. In Drupal 8, there might still be a hook for what you're trying to do, and we're going to look at some instances of hooks today and how you can work with them. A form alter is still a form alter, don't worry. But this whole idea of there's just a function that you can call from anywhere and it'll work is a little different, right? So the taxonomy term load example I gave you, which I'll show you more of here shortly, you can't just call it by itself. You have to do something else now. So I would say that while the approach is similar, it is different enough that a higher level of skill is generally required to be successful at PHP development in Drupal 8. A lot of that has to do with the way that PHP has evolved over the years, not just the way Drupal has evolved. Something that you're going to run into a lot, and I will actually show you an example of today, is that naming conventions and file placement matter a lot. If you accidentally name a file the wrong thing, if you accidentally name a folder the wrong thing, or put it in the wrong place, your code's just never going to run. And debugging. Devel, unfortunately, is not the end-all, be-all solution to trying to figure out what the heck is going on with your site. We're actually into using like a real debugger, like Big Boys and Girls, and we'll, again, take a look at that here shortly. So let's do our trusty form alter example here. And this is actually from the Drupal 7 version of the Drupal GovCon website, which predates me. I had to go digging a little bit to find this. We are adding honeypot to some form. I don't know which one. But in this particular example, you can see that we're passing in the form and the form state into a form alter, just like you always might. We're calling some other function, and that's it. Nothing terribly fancy in this particular instance. If we look at a Drupal 8 form alter, this is actually not that different, right? There's literally two differences here. We're type hinting that form is an array, and we're type hinting that form state is an instance of a form state interface class. So back and forth between a Drupal 7 hook form alter and a Drupal 8 hook form alter, there's really not much different. And I'll let you in on a little hint. This isn't a Drupal change. This is a PHP change. So we're not saying that Drupal is now requiring this. It's just we're following better practices. And that is sort of my second takeaway. The Drupal community at large, I would say, is a little behind the rest of the world when it comes to coding conventions and coding standards. So a lot of the changes that I personally struggled with as somebody who didn't have a formal programming background was stuff that if I had learned Java first, I wouldn't have had any problem here. But I learned how to do PHP for WordPress, and then I learned how to do PHP for Drupal 7 and Drupal 6. So things like type hinting and dependency injection and magic methods and all the fun sort of object-oriented programming terminology were things that I had to learn from the ground up. So again, if you are somebody who has a rich development background or you've done object-oriented programming in other languages, you're actually sitting in a really great place. You're actually sitting in a better place than I was when I took this on. And if you're not, that's okay. Just be aware that not only are you now taking the leap from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, you're also going to be taking the leap from sort of this non-object-oriented PHP world into an object-oriented PHP world. So I already gave the example of loading a term. So in Drupal 7, you could literally do taxonomy term load, assuming you've got the term ID, anywhere you want. Doesn't matter. As long as you know a term ID, you can load that term into memory. And in Drupal 8, it's not that different. You have to have a use statement. So in this case, we're saying we're going to use the term entity. And the namespace there kind of gives you a hint of where to find that in the code. And then you can call the term load method, term being the class, and load being the method on term ID. And the output of this is, again, going to be very similar to what you would have seen in Drupal 7. You just have to call it a little differently. Part of the reason I recommend using an IDE is if you say, well, what is that load function actually doing? How does it work? Where does it come from? You can go in and inspect the code on the fly. You can find other uses of that code if you want to see how it's being used in other places. You can find the declaration of that code, which is what I'm going to show you here, and you can have a look. And I really, really want to highlight that what I'm looking at now is actually not the taxonomy term load right? That's entity load. So what that means is that the taxonomy system, when it calls a load on your term ID, doesn't have its own load function. What it's doing is it's actually going all the way back to the core entity definition of load, and it's doing it from there. And you're going to find this over and over and over again in the Drupal code base, and it's something hopefully you mirror in your own code, where you abstract your code to the point where you can say, all right, I'm going to write a generic load function that's going to take care of maybe 90% of my entities. So I have an entity ID, I want to go get that entity and load it into memory so then I can do something with it. And theoretically, if a block's an entity and a term's an entity and a node's an entity and a user's an entity, I can probably use most of that same code for all 4 of those circumstances. And maybe menus are weird and we need to do something completely different for menus. So now we're going to write a different load function for my menu entity, but we're still going to use the same entity load for the other 4. Now you've written 2 functions instead of 5. And if you follow this practice over and over and over again, the number of lines of code that you write is going to go way down. But the underlying architectural principles of what you've written and the complexity of designing that code is going to go up. Because you can't just put your head down and go, okay, I'm going to go write this and you go write that and we'll high five at the end and release it. Beer. You have to actually sit down and plan and think. I'm going to knock this microphone off. You actually have to sit down and think about what you're trying to do, not just right here, but at the macro level in the application. And this is part of the reason I suggest that you take some time to go back and look at what they've done in Drupal 8, because they did a really good job abstracting these things out with Drupal 8. I think they did a pretty bad job documenting it, but they did a really good job writing it. And if you can get your head wrapped around how they did it, you're going to be very successful. Here is where I started running into major problems. Where can I do this entity load? So in a .module file, in Drupal 8, you still have many traditional hooks, as I've told you, right? So you can still do a form alter. Cool. You can still do a pre-save. So after you've submitted your form and it's validated and it's getting submitted into the database, you can intercept the data and monkey with it before it actually gets saved. You can do a cron, okay. You can go into an install file, .install, and you can have an install hook. So when your module turns on, that hook will fire, or if you run a database update, the update hook will fire. And that literally gives you like 5 different places you can screw with stuff, right? I mean, that's not that many. And the question is, well, if I want to do other things that I know I could do in Drupal 7, like writing custom Drush scripts, creating fields, creating entities, putting in custom pages that people can visit and then having custom code execute on those pages, like there's not hooks for that anymore. Like, how do I do that? A form alter is great to learn how to write a term load, but it sucks for giving a user access to a page, right? That's never going to be the solution. So I cannot stress this enough. You cannot rely on hooks in Drupal 8 to do everything that you want to do. You have to understand the routing system. You have to understand how to use the plugin system. And we're going to get into some examples of that today. So before we do hit those examples, so let's talk about a few of the new things that you're going to get to work with in Drupal 8. So classes. Again, classes are, in this case, we're saying a PHP thing, but really classes are a programming thing, right? This isn't a Drupal thing. This isn't a PHP thing. Any object-oriented language is going to have classes. Classes get defined in a namespace. And as you'll see in my examples coming up, you can actually have very similar or even identical classes that exist in different namespaces. And as long as you call the correct namespace, you will get the correct version of the code. Classes are where you're going to define most of your functions and methods, or functions or methods, same word for the same thing. And the functions and methods are where you're going to do the bulk, hopefully, of your heavy lifting in the application. Now, if you ever take a class, or if you ever actually read deeply on application design, there are people that have very firm opinions on how complicated a function or a method should be. That gets into unit testing and so on and so forth. We're not going to talk about that today, but put a pin in that. That might be worth your time at some point. You can also define constants and variables. So if your application is doing things with session tracking, or if you're going to have different behaviors in different environments, you don't just have to define functions at the class level. You can actually set variables at the class level, and then you can use those variables to customize the application based on where the user is, who they are, what server they're on, et cetera, et cetera. And then classes can override and extend other classes. And we already talked a little bit about this with the load example. If I want my load to behave differently than the core entity load function, I can extend the core entity class, and then I can rewrite the load function in the way that I want it to work instead of the way that Drupal makes it work. So to actually use a class in my code, let's look at some examples here. So if I want to access a method of a class, you can see here on this line, for instance, I can actually call the getStorage method on some variable. The important thing is that you've loaded those into your function. And we actually had a little bit better example of that. I'm going to go back a few slides here with this term load, right? So that's actually a little bit easier example to look at. So the term load in this case is you are saying, wherever you are in your code, I want to access the load function that exists in the term class. So I'm going to pull that class in and then use it as I see fit. You can also extend a class, which we very briefly talked about a moment ago. So in this case, somewhere in Drupal, there is a content entity form class. And then there is also, in the node module, a node form class. And the second that I extend content entity form is going to take on all of the characteristics, sorry, node form will take on all of the characteristics of content entity form. And I'm going to show you guys sort of a hands-on example of this here shortly, so don't worry about it too much. But the gist is that node form is now going to look, act, and behave identically to content entity form, but it gives me room to customize this. And then finally, you can instantiate a class. And this is a little different. This is starting to get a little bit more advanced. But in this case, on line 526, you can see that entity type manager, a variable, is getting set to Drupal entity type manager, a service. And what's going to happen here is then on 527, you can see entity type manager is calling the getStorage method. So we've actually taken this entity type manager class and loaded it into a variable, and then you can use that in your code. There are some reasons why you would do it this way versus the term : load, and we'll talk about those more as we go. Another new thing, and again, naming conventions are a really, really, really big deal. We're going to talk about routing quite a bit today. But back in ye olden days of 3 years ago with Drupal 7, as long as you could spell info and as long as you could spell module, you're going to be highly successful in doing custom PHP development, right? At that point, it doesn't really matter what the heck you call stuff. As long as you can get that file named right, you're fine. Drupal 8, there's a few more, like services and libraries, that you have to be able to spell properly. The one that bites me 100% of the time is plugin. The source folder has to be lowercase. Plugin has to be uppercase. And then depending on which plugin you're working with, it might be lowercase or it might be uppercase. Block is uppercase, views is lowercase. I don't have an issue for that one, but if you'd like to create one, I will complain with you. But again, this is an example of if you want to see how a views plugin works, go find a views plugin somewhere in Drupal core and you can say, oh, okay, it's lowercase views, not uppercase views. There you go. But takeaway number 4, and I cannot tell you how many hours I have wasted on this. Sometime in your Drupal 8 development career, you are going to be sitting there refreshing a page, flushing caches, running cron, trying to debug, and nothing is happening. And then you're going to realize that, oh, crap, plugin's supposed to be capitalized. It'll happen to you. So just keep in mind that sometimes it's a much dumber mistake than you think it is, and it could literally be that you spelled something wrong or you put it at the wrong level. And there's nothing to do but find that, notice it, and fix it. Spelling matters, kids. All right, number 5, and again, I already talked a little bit about this, but I just really want to stress it again. Use the right tool for the right job. Don't dive too deep into this unless you've got a debugger set up, which means you've got a local environment set up, and you've got some sort of IDE set up, whether it's PHP Storm or other. Because the second you get in trouble, you're going to go, oh crap, Mike said I needed a debugger, and then you're going to have to stop trying to fix what you are doing and go set that up, and just do this first. Okay, so let's dig into some examples. Again, code sample link. Don't feel like you have to try and furiously scribble all this down. You're welcome to clone, fork, or do anything else you want with this code. First thing we're going to do is create a custom page. So in Drupal 7, to do this, you would have used hook menu, which is going to insert the Drupal 7 equivalent of a route. And then you're going to use the hook page view hook to generate the contents of that page based on whatever the heck you called it in the menu. In Drupal 8, you're not going to use a hook at all. No hooks. Drupal 8, you're going to define a custom route. And then your custom route is going to point to some custom PHP code in a controller that will generate the output of that page. So we're going to do a hello world example. Oh, of course, something always goes wrong in a live demo. It can't not. One moment. Here I am intentionally breaking things for future demonstrative purposes, and it's causing issues. All right, so we've got a hello world here, and pardon me while I get rid of a couple of other things that we'll look at later on. So this simple hello world statement comes from a couple of lines of code. So this, for those of you that have cloned the file or will do so later, you're going to see that there are 3 files in this example 1 routing module to make this work. We've got the .info.yaml file, which is pretty boring in this case. There's no dependencies here. It just defines an example module. We have a .routing file, and this is starting to get really important because anything you screw up in here is going to just make this not work at all. So you have to have a unique name for your route. This is the ID of your route. The path can be whatever you want it to be, as long as it doesn't exist someplace else. So in my case, it's /hello. A controller is a special kind of PHP class. We're not going to talk a ton about what that is today. Just know that a controller is a thing that you put PHP into. And here you define the location of that controller. So you can see Drupal. Most things are namespaced in Drupal. Example 1 routing, controller, hello world, controller. And if you look over here, you're going to see controller, hello world, controller. Notice these matches exactly. Same capitalization schema, same spelling. If you do not do that, it is going to complain at you. Inside this file, you'll see my namespace. My namespace is exactly the same as it is in my routing file. Again, if you do not have, basically, up to controller, the exact same namespace, it will complain at you. And if your class does not match the name of the file, and that does not match the final part of your namespace in the routing file, it will complain at you. The hello method that is being defined here is the only function in this class. So with comments, this is 29 lines of code to say hello world on a page. Without comments, you could do it in a few less. If you wanted to, you could actually drill down and see what this controller base class does, but for the sake of time, I will let you explore that on your own. But the gist of it is you can very quickly, with just a few lines of code, get a hello world statement out onto a page. Now, this is pretty terrible application design, right? Because it just is going to say hello. It doesn't have a template. It doesn't recognize a user. It doesn't do anything fancy. It's literally just the words hello world. So let's move into our second example, which is more or less an exact clone of what we just did. It's the same routing. It's actually the same class, the same controller. We're just calling this one advanced hello. And if you come into the hello world controller, I want to stress that this is exactly the same class. It's just namespaced differently. And because the route calls the other namespace, I'm not getting a conflict between those two things. So you can literally copy and paste classes between modules and just update the namespaces and you're fine. Again, if I was designing this a little more intelligently, we'd reuse, like this would have extended the base class, but we're trying to keep the ball rolling here. So let's stay simple. This hello world controller is a little bit more fancy, right? We don't just have markup coming back that always says hello. So in this case, you can see that I'm calling the current user method to figure out the current user. And then I'm doing a Drupal user entity load on the current user's ID. And then I'm doing a quick check on the value of user UID to say if it's larger than 0, say hello to that user. And if it is not larger than 0, then to say hello anonymous. And some of you may have caught my mistake on that page if you were reading carefully. We will come back to that in just a moment. So when I pull up my advanced hello page, even though I'm logged in, it's saying hello anonymous. So let's quickly turn to our trusty debugger and see if we can figure out why I'm getting that. All right, so I'm gonna do a quick watch on my value. And again, if you're reading carefully, you are probably not surprised that that doesn't work because I put in val, not value. So if I so desire, I could actually step through the code and figure out what's going on. But in this case, the point was simply to show you how you can quickly use a debugger. The point is, if you have a value that you're watching, if you're doing something, you can put in a watch so you can see how that value changes over time. My website is frozen, right? This is gonna sit here and spin forever and ever and ever until the server times out or I hit the play button. And debuggers can very quickly and very easily help you step through your code and understand why it isn't behaving the way you thought it would. Why am I getting this version of the if statement as opposed to this version of the if statement, etc. So I've removed my breakpoint, I can refresh, and now I'm actually seeing advanced hello as intended, so showing me the username as opposed to anonymous when I'm not logged in. We haven't talked a whole lot about code standards. And I just want to briefly show you guys this. This is one of our BLT functions, BLT validate. Basically what validate does is it runs PHP code sniffer using community standards from the Drupal community and PHP best practices against the code base. And I just showed you code that works great and fails best practices. So even though I didn't explicitly state this as a takeaway, I want to stress that not only are there a lot of things or ways to do things in Drupal, there are a lot of ways to do things in PHP. From a security perspective, from an application design perspective, from a best practices perspective, there's a lot of really boneheaded things you can do that will work. So using a tool like PHP Code Sniffer, especially as you're sort of wading farther and farther into custom PHP development, will hopefully stop you from doing silly things. In some cases like this, it's going to cause you to do some additional work, but that's okay. I did it ahead of time, so I can just quickly walk us back through this. And again, I have committed both versions of this code so you guys can check out the differences. The big difference is that in the sort of proper version of this code, we're actually using a constructor magic method. If you've not heard that term before, anything with an underscore is a magic method, meaning that nowhere in Drupal, Symfony, or otherwise is this constructor function explicitly defined. We can then use something called dependency injection to actually load up some of the stuff that I was doing previously. And when we get down here now, instead of doing sort of the previous Drupal user stuff that I was doing, now I'm using the entity type manager to load up the user object, and then I'm loading the current user ID that way. At the end of the day, they work exactly the same. At the end of the day, this way is more better according to, again, sort of PHP best practices. But the point I wanted to illustrate here is you can write perfectly functional code that still is not right. And as a technical architect, this is something I battle every day. Developers spend a lot of time, get very passionate about something that they wrote that is working, but it isn't secure, so we can't merge it. Or they write something that won't pass validation, so we can't merge it. We have this actually wired into our continuous integration process. So every time you do a pull request, that pull request will fail if the code is not written to community standards. So food for thought, something to hopefully inject a little, if nothing else, emotion into your otherwise dull workday. All right, next thing, let's talk a little bit about a plugin system. So what we just talked about in these first two examples is the routing system. And the routing system, basically, you literally say, I want this, and I want it to point there. So you send a person or an endpoint to this, and it points there, and then magic happens. The plugin system is a way that Drupal allows you to very quickly and easily build stuff that you're going to need on every website. So fields are plugins, blocks are plugins, views, filters, and fields, and sorts, and so on and so forth are all plugins. So you don't have to build a route to build a field. Like, that doesn't make a ton of sense. So generally, plugins are things that are going to be used as building blocks for other parts of the website, whereas routes are things that you're going to send an application or a user to actually go visit and have stuff happen. So we're going to go back to the original example. We're going to do a hello world block. And you can see in example 3 that we do have a couple of additional files here. The biggie, as we talked about earlier, is that we have source plugin, capital B for block. And we have a hello world block file here. This looks very similar to a controller. It is a type of controller. It just happens to not live in the controller folder. Is what it is. I want to quickly point this out. This may look like a comment. It is, but it is also a very special type of comment called an annotation. There are certain places in Drupal 8, plugins being one of them, entity definitions being another, where if you do not have an annotation, your code will not work. The ID for this block is only defined on line 13. There is nowhere else in my code or the code anywhere else that tells Drupal that the unique identifier for this thing that we're writing is hello world block. If you do not have an annotation that does not define the ID, your block's not going to work. So again, this is one of those just little gotchas. This is one of those things that you either know it or you don't, that you definitely want to take some time to understand, look at good examples, or you will go insane. In our hello world block, we have 2 methods here. We're going to start with the simpler one, and this is a build method. In this case, we're literally returning a theme, which is telling it what theme hook to use. We'll look at that in a sec. And then we're returning some text, which I've hard-coded to hello world. The other function is the block form, which if you were paying attention as I was madly removing some example blocks from this page, you might have seen it. I can go into my block layout page. I can do place content. I can place my block. And in this case, there's nothing super fancy on this form. It's literally just the stock Drupal 8 block configuration form. And if you look at the code, that makes sense because it just goes in and gets the parent block form and returns it. This is another little gotcha. This bit me 2 nights ago when I was doing this example. Does anybody know why I have to have this return here? Anybody? I'm sorry? Right, it's not doing a pass by reference, so you have to return it. If I had that, which this particular function doesn't support, that's fine, it won't work anyway. But the point is, some Drupal 8 functions have pass by reference, meaning it just, whatever you do to it is immediate. Some of them do not, and you actually have to pass back the array. So in this case, you have to pass back form, otherwise it will not render. So as I mentioned down here, we're defining a hello world theme hook. If you did Drupal 7 theming at all, this should not look different. It's the same. You're basically going to put together a little render array where you define the hello world theme and your variable text in this case. And then I've defined a hello world template, which lives under the templates folder. I'm sure you're surprised to hear that. And then we've got the hello world.html.twig file. And we're not going to really spend much time on Twig today, but I've just shown you how even in a Twig file, you can do really boneheaded HTML stuff that isn't dynamic at all. And this works fine. So if I want to save this block and save my block page, I can now come back here, refresh, because this is technically the old one, and you can see my hello world block. Again, this is cool because it works and it's a great example to kind of get your feet wet, but it's not really very useful because you're never, well, hopefully never going to literally hard code something this silly. So let's look at a perhaps more useful example. Again, if you look at this, like from a high level, these modules are identical. The exact same files, the exact same classes. I guess I renamed this one. It's a little different, but in general, these are very similar. Except we've introduced an entirely new concept here, which is configuration. We're not going to talk a ton about configuration, but we'll talk a little bit about configuration. So first, we're still doing the same thing. We go and get the out-of-the-box Drupal 8 block config form, set that equal to form. Then I define 3 fields, and let me show you what this looks like in the UI. So if I come into my content area, I do place block. This one has some fields on it. And again, if you're reading ahead in my code, that shouldn't be terribly surprising to you. I'm capturing a session, a person, and a text field where I've defined a session name, person name, and greeting. I'm using that config object as a way of pre-populating my block field. So when I go in and fill out the block field, if I already have something in my configuration for session, it'll populate the form with the name of the session. If I don't, it's null. Same with person, same with text. So I can fill this out, as you see I did while I was practicing for this with PHP development. And then I can come back down to my hello advanced and I can load the form back up and PHP development is still there. That's an important detail. I also have a block submit function here, which I didn't have in my previous example because we want to make sure that all of the fields in my form are being saved into active configuration. And there are several ways you can do this. This is a fairly quick and expedient way of doing it, where I'm literally telling it which fields I want to save into config. And then the last thing in my build function, you'll see that I've actually then not hard-coded text person in session. I've actually taken those config variables, if set, and passed them into my build. And that means that when we go look at the theme hook for this one, we're going to see a little different setup, right? Text person session. And then if I look at my twig file, we're going to see something a little different as well. Refresh one more time. We're actually going to get something out of this here. So the sort of point is that you can build as far or as short as you want into these custom blocks and use things like configuration, use things like entities, nodes, etc., to actually populate them with content, just like you would using the out-of-the-box configuration system. So we're almost out of time. Let me just leave you with a couple of last thoughts. What we've talked about today will hopefully build you a really good foundation to move deeper into this, right? So if you want to go do custom drush commands, what we've talked about today is not an exact one-to-one parallel, but go check out this article or others similar to it, and I think you'll find that a lot of what we talked about today directly correlates to drush commands. If you want to do custom views fields, it's way easier than it was in Drupal 7, and it's very similar to the block example that we just did. And you can also do custom entities, and sorry, my Zoom bar is in the way here. There was actually a session at DrupalCon Baltimore that was pretty well attended about that. You can find a lot on Drupal entities. The point is, once you've figured out how to actually get this code to run, you're going to be doing the same thing everywhere. You might call it a little different, you might approach it a little different, but it's all variations on a theme. And I know for me, getting my code to actually run using sort of this PHP approach as opposed to the hook approach was like a dam breaking, right? I mean, that was the biggest thing that was stopping me from being successful with Drupal 8. So hopefully that helps. And I can't stress enough, the reason we talked about these things today, there is value in simplicity. So even though you're never going to push a production website with a hello world block on it, the fact that you, as a developer, can go in without my example code and write a block or write a route that ends up with something on a page means that you can do any of this other stuff that we've talked about, right? That's a really critical first step, and it's something that you shouldn't blaze by because it's a very foundational skill. We very, very, very briefly touched on configuration today. I'm spending an hour talking about configuration tomorrow. I believe it's at 3 o'clock. So we will kind of pick up where I left off here and continue talking more about the configuration management system, how you can use that in custom module development, and most importantly, how you integrate it into your development workflow, because that's where the magic happens. I'd love to take any of your questions. Thank you. Anybody? Yes. Mm-hmm. So the question is, custom modules on the website are breaking during major Drupal updates, like going from 8.3 to 8.4, what was working is no longer working. So API changes are constantly happening, right? So if you go out and look at any module, not just the custom ones, they're written to a specific version of Drupal, and most of Drupal doesn't change that much from 8.1 to 8.2 to 8.3 to 8.4. But I mean, that is an unfortunate part of doing business, and it really stresses the importance of having a robust development and testing pipeline to make sure that if 8.6 is coming out soon, you should be testing the beta version of 8.6 against your current code. If it stops working, you should be looking at the module, understanding what methods are being used in that module, going out and looking at the documentation to understand, did these change? How did they change if they did? How are other modules accommodating this particular problem? I would say 99% of the time, once you have a module stable and working, I mean, unless you're really doing something funky, you shouldn't have too much trouble upgrading. But I mean, it's going to happen. I mean, you're going to do an upgrade sooner or later. If nothing else, you're going to upgrade to Drupal 9 and something's going to break. So getting used to what that update process looks like for you and your project and understanding how to go back in and fix those things is quite important. Second point, and then we'll answer that other question. Watch out for deprecated functions. So this is something I did actually have in a picture, but I didn't talk about. So line 7 here, you see this function scratched out. So entity manager interface is a deprecated class. So what that basically means is that it's still in the code base, but they don't want you to use it anymore. So if you have an IDE, your IDE should be telling you that. So writing your code that's up to standards using something like PHP Sniffer and having somebody like a technical architect or a lead dev review code to look for deprecated code are both really great ways of sort of future-proofing your code to make sure that updates won't break on down the road. Sorry, I saw a hand. Yes, sir. No, I know exactly what you're talking about. So the question is, why is there no source under, so like if we go back to our controller example in the namespace here, why does this not say source? Magic? I don't know. Yes. Yeah. So if you're writing custom PHP code and you want it to work, put it under a lowercase source directory. There is probably somebody at this con who could answer that question way better than I could. I don't see Gerardo in the room, or I'd make him answer it. But oh, Adam's in the room. He can answer that question way better than I can. So in a nutshell, what Adam just said is Drupal 8 uses PSR4, which is a standard for auto detection, and you're welcome to go read about that because I'm not going to try and auto. Yeah, it's magic. That's all you need to know. Other questions in the room? Okay, I'm going to hang out for a few minutes, so if you have questions you're not brave enough to ask, come find me. Otherwise, thank you. I hope you guys have a great rest of your week at GovCon. Thank you very much.